You want to know a secret about being a Roman citizen. It was mostly standing in line, not fighting in the Colosseum, not conquering Gaul, not reclining on a couch eating dormice in honey, even though, yes, that was a real dish, and yes, we'll get to it, standing in line, outside a rich man's door, before the sun was fully up, waiting for your name to be called by a slave whose entire job was to know exactly how important you were, and to say so out loud in front of everyone else waiting with you. That's the part nobody puts on the poster. Here's the thing about Roman citizen as a phrase. It sounds like a costume you put on, toga, sandals, maybe a laurel wreath if you're having a really good day. It sounds like a status that came with automatic comfort. Vote in the forum, eat some grapes, watch a chariot race, repeat. The reality was a machine. A finely tuned, deeply unequal, occasionally beautiful machine that measured your worth every single hour of the day and made sure you knew your number in the queue. Citizenship in Rome wasn't a hammock. It was a hierarchy with really good marketing. And the strange part, the part that's going to sit with you a while, is how much of it you'd recognize. The performance of being busy. The status update disguised as a favor. The unpaid labor holding up other people's mornings so they can look effortless. Rome didn't invent any of that, but it did write it down in exhausting, wonderful detail, and today you get to walk through it hour by hour. So let's do that. Let's follow one day, a composite day, built from real letters, real poems, real complaints scratched onto wax tablets and papyrus almost 2,000 years ago, from the moment Rome wakes up to the moment it locks its doors against the dark. You'll meet the senator, the shopkeeper, the slave, the freedman, the poet who couldn't pay rent, and the woman whose entire legal existence depended on which man was currently alive. None of them are having the day you think they're having. Quick housekeeping before we start the clock. If you're new here, welcome. We do this every week. Ordinary people, extraordinary systems. The stuff history skips over because it wasn't dramatic enough to paint on a vase. If that's your thing, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. A comment helps too. Tell me which hour of Roman life sounds worse than yours. I read every one of them. And if you've got a friend who thinks history is just kings and battles, send them this. They're about to find out it's mostly logistics and humiliation, same as now. All right, it's still dark outside. Rome hasn't rung a bell because it doesn't have one. Let's start there. The insult of sleeping in. You wake up because a rooster started screaming somewhere nearby, and there is nothing you can do about it. No alarm clock, no phone. No clean digital number telling you it's 5:47 a.m. Just birds and light and the particular sound of a city that has already been awake for a while, because a huge portion of Rome never really slept in the way you do. Here's the first thing that would throw you off if you actually lived this day. Romans didn't tell time the way you do. There were no fixed 60-minute hours. Instead, daylight, sunrise to sunset, was divided into 12 equal hours, which meant an hour in June was much longer than an hour in December. The night got the same treatment, split into 12 of its own. So the second hour wasn't a fixed clock time, it moved with the seasons. It's less like a wristwatch and more like a proportion. You're not asking what time is it. You're asking how much of the day is gone. Sundials existed. Rome got its first public one in 263 BC, looted from Catania in Sicily during the First Punic War, and this part is almost too good. It kept the wrong time for a full century because nobody adjusted it for Rome's different latitude. An entire city told time by a sundial calibrated for a different city for 100 years, and mostly nobody noticed or cared. Water clocks or clepsydry came later and could at least function at night or on cloudy days, but they weren't in every home. For most people, time was the sun, the shadows, and a rough sense of the stalls smell like fresh bread, so it must be around the second hour. Which brings us to the actual insult buried in this chapter. Sleeping late was not neutral in Rome. It wasn't just personal preference, whatever works for you. It was read as a moral failure, soft, indulgent, un-Roman. The elder Pliny, the naturalist, the guy who died getting a closer look at Vesuvius, was famous for waking before dawn, and his nephew, Pliny the Younger, wrote about it with the specific pride of someone bragging about a relative's discipline at a family dinner. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, treated the pre-dawn hours as the only honest hours of the day, the time before the world's noise and social obligations arrived to eat your attention alive. And that phrase, eat your attention alive, is doing real work here, because that's exactly what was coming for you next. If you were a citizen of any real standing in Rome, a client, someone tied by obligation to a wealthier patron, your first task of the day wasn't breakfast. It wasn't stretching. It was getting dressed fast enough and formally enough to be standing outside another man's front door before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops. Because if you were late, someone else got there first, and in Rome, the order you arrived in wasn't a footnote. It was the entire performance. Let's set the scene for what's actually about to happen to you before we get there. You live, let's say, in an insula. That's a Roman apartment block, usually 5 or 6 stories, sometimes more before the building codes got tightened after enough of them collapsed. Ground floor, shops, maybe a bakery, maybe a laundry business reeking of stale urine, because urine was a genuine industrial input in Rome. More on that later. It's better than it sounds and also somehow worse. Upper floors, apartments, getting cheaper and more dangerous the higher you climb, because higher floors meant a longer run if the building caught fire, and insulae caught fire constantly. Rome burned down in parts on a regular basis. Not just in the famous fire of 64 AD under Nero, that one just happened to burn down enough of the city that we still talk about it 2,000 years later. Smaller fires were basically background noise. You get up. There's no running water in your apartment unless you're wealthy enough to be on the ground floor with a private connection, which you almost certainly aren't. So somebody, you, or more likely a household slave if your family has even one, has already gone to fetch water from a public fountain fed by one of Rome's aqueducts. And here's a detail worth sitting with. Rome's aqueduct system at its peak is estimated to have delivered somewhere in the range of several 100 million gallons of water a day into the city. That water didn't ask who you were. It flowed to public fountains that any resident, citizen, freedman, slave could use for free. Rome's water supply was, in its own strange way, one of its most genuinely democratic institutions. The doors of powerful men were absolutely not, you get dressed, and here's where it gets uncomfortable, because dressing like a Roman citizen the toga specifically, was nowhere near as simple as movies make it look. The toga was a single piece of wool, semicircular, and by the height of the empire it could measure something like 20 feet across. 20 feet of heavy wool that you're expected to fold, drape, and pin into a specific shape. The sinus, the umbo, the balanced fold over the left shoulder, without it collapsing off your body every time you raise an arm. You basically could not do this alone. You needed help. If you were wealthy, a slave dressed you every single morning, professionally, the way you might have a tailor fit a suit. If you weren't wealthy, you had a much smaller, cheaper toga, or you didn't bother with one at all except on the days it mattered, official business, court appearances. The salutatio we're about to walk into, because the toga was hot, restrictive, expensive to maintain, and honestly kind of a nightmare to move in. There's a reason the poet Martial, and we're going to spend a lot of time with Martial today, because he wrote about Roman daily life with the specific bitterness of a man who lived it and hated most of it, complained constantly about how much the toga cost him just in laundering. Wool absorbs everything. Sweat, dust, the general filth of Roman streets. Keeping a toga white required regular trips to a folonica, a laundry business that used, again, stale urine, collected in public jars that fullers would empty for free, because ammonia from decomposed urine was an excellent cleaning agent, and Emperor Vespasian eventually put a tax on the collection of it, which is the origin of the probably later, possibly apocryphal in exact wording, phrase, "money doesn't smell." Vespasian's actual reported line, when his son complained about profiting off urine, was something like, "Coins don't carry the odor of where they came from. So, you're up, you're dressed in wool that was recently soaking in aged urine at a commercial laundry, and you have somewhere to be. Where you're going next is the single most revealing hour of the entire Roman day, and it's the one that tells you the most uncomfortable truth about what citizen actually meant. You're going to go stand outside a rich man's door. The line outside the door you arrive at the house, the domus of your patron just after dawn, and you are not the first person there. There's already a small crowd. Other clients, other men who, like you, are bound to this one wealthy man through a relationship the Romans called clientela. This is the salutatio, literally, the greeting, and it is one of the most important social institutions in Roman life, and also, if you read the poets who lived through it, one of the most quietly exhausting. Here's how it worked. In exchange for a patron's protection, financial help, legal backing, and general influence, a client owed that patron regular, visible, public deference. The most basic and most demanded form of that deference was showing up every single morning, standing in this crowd, waiting to be let in and personally greeted. Not because the patron needed to see your face, because the size and composition of that crowd outside his door was a walking advertisement of how important he was. A rich, powerful Roman with 100 clients showing up at dawn was a rich, powerful Roman everyone in the neighborhood could see was rich and powerful. Your presence wasn't a favor you were receiving. It was a favor you were performing, and you did not get to walk in whenever you felt like it. There was an order. A slave called the nomenclator, His literal job title translates to something like name caller, stood at the door with effectively a memorized or written guest list and called clients in based on their social rank. Senators first, then equestrians, the wealthy business and land-owning class just below senatorial rank. Then everyone else, roughly by wealth, influence, and usefulness, all the way down to you, standing near the back, possibly for over an hour watching men with better family names walk past you into the house while you wait. This is worth sitting with for a second because it's not subtle. Rome built an entire daily ritual whose primary function was publicly ranking its citizens, out loud, by name, every single morning, and everyone participated in it, including the people it insulted. Martial, again, our man Martial, who spent years as a client himself before eventually getting enough patronage to stop needing to, wrote about the salutatio with real venom. He describes being made to wait for hours only to receive a curt, distracted greeting, a handshake barely acknowledged, before being sent away with nothing but the social credit of having shown up. In one epigram, he complains that he's worn out 3 togas in a year just from attending these morning greetings, for a patron who barely remembers his name. In another, he calculates, with the specific bitterness of a man doing math he already knows will depress him, exactly how little the dole he receives at these greetings, the sportula, is actually worth. The sportula is worth pausing on because it's the transactional core of the whole ritual, dressed up as generosity. Originally, sportula meant an actual small basket of food a patron would give departing clients: bread, a bit of meat, something to take home. Over time, in wealthier households, this shifted to a small cash payment instead, traditionally about 6.25 sesterces per client per morning. It sounds almost charitable until you notice what it actually functioned as: a retainer fee paid daily to guarantee your continued visible loyalty. Some clients, poor citizens with no other reliable income, genuinely depended on this money to eat. Juvenal, in his satires, describes clients so dependent on the sportula that missing a single morning's greeting could mean missing a meal, which means the salutatio wasn't really a greeting at all. It was, for a huge number of Roman citizens, closer to a job. An unpaid or barely paid morning shift, where your labor was your presence, your currency was your dignity, and your wage was a handful of coins that might not even cover what you spent keeping your toga clean enough to be seen in. And here's the detail that turns this from interesting social custom into something genuinely uncomfortable. This entire system ran on the free citizens of Rome voluntarily standing in line to be visibly ranked below other free citizens, because the alternative, losing your patron's support entirely, was worse. You weren't a slave. Nobody could legally force you to attend. And you went anyway because Roman citizenship on its own, without patronage, without connections, without a name someone with power recognized, didn't actually guarantee you much of anything. No safety net, no welfare state beyond eventually the grain dole we'll get to later. If you had no patron, you had no leverage in court, in business, in a housing dispute, in basically any conflict with someone more powerful than you. So you showed up every morning. And you smiled about it because being visibly loyal was the entire transaction. Cicero, decades earlier, wrote about the client-patron relationship as something almost sacred, a foundational Roman virtue, fides, good faith, loyalty, the glue holding society together without needing the state to intervene in every dispute. And there's truth in that. It's also true that sacred social glue and daily humiliation ritual for the poor can be the same institution, depending entirely on which end of the line you're standing in. If you were a patron yourself, this hour looked completely different, and it's worth seeing it from that side too, because the contrast is the whole point. You'd wake up in your own domus, dressed by slaves in a toga you own multiple of, and instead of standing in a crowd, you'd be standing in an atrium, the grand central hall of a wealthy Roman house, open to the sky through a hole in the roof called the compluvium, with a shallow pool below it called the impluvium collecting rainwater. Light pours in. Family portraits, actual wax death masks of ancestors, imaginis maiorum, kept and displayed as a visible ledger of your family's prestige, line the walls. And you'd receive, one by one in careful order, the men who need something from you. You'd greet the senators warmly. You'd greet the equestrians politely. And somewhere near the back of the line, exhausted, sweating slightly through wool that cost him more to maintain than he'd like to admit, a client you barely remember the name of would get a distracted nod and a small handful of coins, and you would already be thinking about your next appointment. That's the salutatio. That's the first hour of a huge number of Roman days, and we haven't even gotten to breakfast yet. Breakfast is a myth, mostly. Here's something that might genuinely surprise you. Most Romans didn't really do breakfast, at least not the way you're picturing it. There was a word for it, intaculum, but it wasn't a sit-down meal with a set menu and a set time, the way we think of it. For a lot of Romans, especially on an ordinary day, it was more like grabbing something on your way out, or eating a small piece of bread standing up, or in a lot of cases just not eating yet. The Roman eating day was built around one real anchor point, and it wasn't the morning. It was the evening meal, the Cena, which we'll get to later, and which was a completely different animal, long, social, performative, sometimes genuinely extravagant. If you did eat something at the start of the day, it was simple. Bread, often just plain, sometimes dipped in wine or olive oil. Maybe some cheese if you had it, maybe leftover food from the night before. This wasn't a peasant thing versus a rich thing. Either wealthy Romans, by most accounts, also kept breakfast minimal. The idea of a large, elaborate first meal of the day just wasn't really part of Roman food culture the way it became in a lot of later European traditions. Around midday there was a slightly more substantial meal, the prandium. Think of it as closer to a light lunch, sometimes eaten cold, sometimes just more bread with something added, fruit, olives, cold meat if you had access to it. For working people, this might be bought from a thermopolium, and this is a word you might actually recognize if you've ever seen photos from Pompeii, because dozens of these places survive there in remarkable condition. A thermopolium was essentially a fast food counter. A masonry counter built into the street-facing wall of a building, with large clay pots called dole set into the counter, holding hot food, stews, legumes, sometimes meat, that customers could buy and eat standing at the counter or take away. This detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells you something about who actually had kitchens. If you lived in an insula, and remember, most of Rome's population did, you very likely didn't have a real kitchen. Cooking with open flame, multiple stories up in a wooden-floored apartment building, was a fire risk landlords actively tried to prevent, and many insula apartments simply weren't built with cooking facilities at all. So for a huge number of ordinary Roman citizens, eating out wasn't a luxury or a treat. It was the only practical option. The thermopolium wasn't fast food as an indulgent choice. It was fast food as basic infrastructure, the same way a lot of people today without full kitchens rely on what's nearby and quick. This is one of those places where the gap between how we picture wealthy Roman life and how most Romans actually lived opens up wide enough to fall into. When you picture a Roman meal, you're probably picturing a triclinium, a formal dining room with 3 couches arranged around a low table, guests reclining on their left elbow, slaves bringing course after course. That's real. That happened. It also describes maybe the top few % of Roman society on their best days. For most citizens, most meals, most days, food was fast, simple, and often eaten standing at a street counter between one obligation and the next. Which brings us to what you'd actually be doing with the rest of your morning, assuming you've survived the salutatio and grabbed a bit of bread on your way out. If you're a citizen of any independent means, a shopkeeper, a craftsman, a small landowner handling business in the city, the middle part of the day was when actual work happened. And work in Rome was a genuinely loaded word, because Roman elite culture drew a sharp moral line between negodium, literally not leisure, business, active affairs, and odium, leisure, contemplation, the cultivating of the mind, which the wealthiest Romans considered the actually noble use of time. This distinction sounds abstract until you realize what it meant in practice. Manual labor, retail trade, most forms of what we'd now call having a job, were, in elite Roman thought, somewhat beneath a truly respectable citizen. Cicero, who, again, we're going to keep running into today, because the man wrote down his opinions on absolutely everything, argued fairly explicitly that trades involving physical labor or direct payment for services were unbecoming of a free man, while activities like large-scale agriculture on land you owned, worked, naturally, by slaves or the law or politics, were the appropriate pursuits of a gentleman. Which means the entire visible engine of the Roman economy, the bakers, the fullers, the blacksmiths, the shopkeepers, the dock workers unloading grain ships at Ostia, was being run every single day by citizens and freedmen and slaves whom the aristocracy considered, in the abstract, somewhat lesser for doing exactly the work that kept Rome fed, clothed, and functioning. You'd feel that if you were one of them. Not as an abstract philosophical insult, necessarily plenty of tradesmen were proud of their crafts, and we have funerary inscriptions from bakers and shoemakers and butchers that show real pride in their work, sometimes literally carved with images of the tools of their trade. But the social hierarchy was there, underneath everything, and everyone knew where they stood in it. A senator did not, generally, sell bread. A senator owned the bakery, or the land the wheat grew on, and someone else, a freedman manager, probably running day-to-day operations, did the actual selling. There's a wonderful, strange exception worth mentioning here, because it complicates the picture in exactly the way good history should: the baker Eurysaces. If you've ever seen photos of a genuinely bizarre-looking Roman tomb near the Porta Maggiore in Rome, built to look like a stack of cylindrical shapes that most scholars think represent grain measuring devices, or the mixing drums of a bakery, that's his. Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces was almost certainly a freedman, a former slave, who became wealthy enough as a baker and public grain contractor to build one of the most elaborate, attention-grabbing tombs that survives from ancient Rome. His tomb's frieze literally depicts the entire bread-making process, in stone, at large scale, kneading, shaping, baking, weighing, presented not with shame but with pride, right at the entrance to the city. Here's the twist worth sitting with. The aristocracy who might have privately considered baking beneath a real gentleman couldn't stop a successful baker from building a monument bigger and more visible than most senators managed. Money and pride found a way around the social snobbery, even if the snobbery never fully went away. So, mid-morning in Rome, the senator is finishing his salutatio, moving toward the forum for business, legal cases, political maneuvering. The shopkeeper has been open since early light and will stay open through most of the day. The baker's ovens have been running since before dawn, bread needed to be ready early, and bakeries in Pompeii, which give us our best physical evidence, show large stone mills worked by donkeys or in poorer operations by slaves or condemned criminals, grinding grain continuously. And you, whoever you are in this composite day, are heading somewhere next that ties the entire morning together. You're heading to the forum. The forum was basically the internet. You walk into the Roman forum, and the first thing that hits you is the noise. This wasn't a quiet monument. It wasn't marble silence and dignified statues, the way it looks now, stripped down to ruins and tourist paths. In its working centuries, the Forum Romanum was closer to a cross between a stock exchange, a courthouse, a newsroom, and a public square where every piece of gossip in the city eventually passed through. Vendors shouting prices. Lawyers arguing cases loud enough for a crowd to gather and listen, because Roman trials were public entertainment as much as legal process. Political candidates campaigning, news, actual news, read aloud or posted publicly, moving through the crowd. That last part is worth its own moment, because Rome had something startlingly close to a newspaper centuries before the printing press. The acta diurna, daily acts or daily proceedings, were public notices, reportedly instituted under Julius Caesar around 59 BC, carved or written and posted in public places, recording government proceedings, trial outcomes, notable births and deaths, even gladiatorial results and public announcements. Copies could be made by scribes and circulated further, sometimes to Romans living outside the city who wanted to stay current. It wasn't the internet. But it was Rome trying to solve the exact same problem the internet solves. How do you keep a huge, dispersed population informed about what's happening, with wax, stone, and human messengers instead of fiber optic cable? If you were a citizen with actual legal or business affairs, this is where you'd spend a huge portion of your day, because Roman legal and financial business was fundamentally a face-to-face, in-person, publicly witnessed activity. Contracts were often sealed in front of witnesses. Court cases were argued in open air or covered basilicas, long rectangular buildings used for legal proceedings and business. And yes, basilica is exactly where the later architectural term for large Christian churches comes from, borrowed directly from these Roman civic buildings. Roman law itself deserves a beat here, because it's one of the things Rome genuinely built that outlasted the empire by roughly 2,000 years and counting. The idea of codified law applied, at least in principle, consistently with defined legal procedures, professional advocates, and a body of jurisprudence built up case by case, is a Roman contribution to the world that shows up today in legal systems across the planet, especially those built on civil law traditions. When your country's contract law uses concepts like good faith, it's very possibly, distantly, echoing Roman legal categories. But matters a lot. Access to that legal system was not equal, and it was never pretending to be. If you were a wealthy citizen, you had actual advocates, professional or semi-professional public speakers, trained in rhetoric, who could argue your case with real skill. Cicero built an entire career, and eventually a political career on top of that, purely on his ability as a courtroom advocate. If you were poor, you might have a patron argue for you, or represent yourself as best you could, or simply lose, because Roman courts, like most courts throughout most of history, tended to favor whoever could afford better representation and had more social standing behind them. And if you were a woman, the picture changes entirely, regardless of wealth. This is worth stating plainly, because it's easy to let the word citizen paper over it. A Roman woman, even a freeborn citizen from a wealthy family, generally could not represent herself in most legal proceedings, couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, and for most of Roman history operated under some form of legal guardianship, first her father's, then her husband's, or a designated male guardian if neither was available. There were real exceptions and real complexities. Roman women, especially in the later Republic and Empire, had property rights that were, in some respects, more expansive than women in a lot of later historical periods. A Roman woman could own property, run businesses through agents, and inherit wealth. Tyria, a woman whose story survives through an extraordinary funerary inscription known as the Laudatio Tyrii, reportedly took direct, dangerous action to protect her husband during the political violence of the late Republic, hiding him and negotiating for his safety while he was a fugitive, actions that required real legal and practical savvy. But she did all of that operating inside a legal framework that, on paper, still treated her as needing male oversight for many formal transactions. So when you picture Roman citizen walking through the forum doing business, you have to picture simultaneously all the citizens who legally could not do most of what's happening in front of them, no matter how wealthy, no matter how capable, purely because of who they were. Back to the forum floor. If you weren't there for legal business, you might be there for money, literally. The forum was also home to Rome's financial district in miniature. Moneylenders, bankers, argentarii, currency exchange, auctions. Roman banking wasn't primitive. Argentarii took deposits, extended credit, facilitated payments between parties who weren't in the same city, kept records that functioned something like modern account ledgers. If you needed to borrow money to expand a business or cover a bad harvest, or very commonly, cover gambling debts, this is roughly where you'd end up. And if you were extremely unlucky or extremely unwise, this is also where you might end up in serious debt bondage. Roman debt law, especially in earlier periods, could be brutal. The ancient practice of nexum, essentially pledging your own labor or body as collateral for debt, was eventually reformed and limited, notably by the Lex Poetilia Papiria around 326 BC, which restricted the practice of enslaving citizens for unpaid debt. But debt remained a serious, life-altering danger throughout Roman history, and the forum, glittering, loud, full of opportunity, was also where a bad decision could cost you your freedom, your family's land, or in some documented cases, your children, who could in earlier periods be sold to cover a father's debts. By midday, the forum would be near its peak, crowds thickest, voices loudest. Business, gossip, law, and politics all happening in the same open space, often simultaneously, often about each other. And then, for a huge portion of Roman society, though notably not for everyone, the day would start to shift toward something Rome genuinely perfected as a social institution, and which we haven't touched yet at all: the baths. The baths weren't about getting clean. You walk into the baths in the early afternoon, and if you're picturing a place where Romans went to quietly wash themselves, you're picturing the least important part of what actually happened there. The Roman baths, thermae in their grandest imperial form, smaller balnea in more modest neighborhood versions, were public infrastructure on a scale that's genuinely hard to overstate. The baths of Caracalla, completed around 216 AD, covered roughly 25 acres and, by some estimates, could accommodate over 1,000 bathers at a time. The baths of Diocletian, finished decades later, were even larger. These weren't just bathing facilities. They were libraries, gyms, gardens, art galleries, meeting halls, and social clubs, all built around a genuinely clever piece of engineering: the hypocaust system, which circulated hot air beneath raised floors and through hollow wall spaces to heat entire rooms and pools without a single visible fire inside them. Here's what your visit would actually involve, and it's more of a sequence than a single act. You'd typically move through the apoditerium, a changing room, where, if you could afford it, a slave watched your clothes so they didn't get stolen, because bathhouse theft was apparently common enough to be a recognized nuisance in Roman writing. Then you might exercise in the palestra, an open exercise yard, wrestling, ball games, something to work up a sweat. Then the actual bathing sequence: the tepidarium, a warm room to ease you in; the caldarium, a genuinely hot room with a hot plunge pool, often the most architecturally spectacular space in the complex; and finally the frigidarium, a cold plunge to close your pores and, frankly, shock your entire nervous system back awake. Along the way, if you had money, a slave called an unctor would rub you down with oil and then scrape it off, along with sweat, dirt, and dead skin, using a curved metal tool called a strigil. This wasn't optional hygiene theater. Soap, as we understand it, wasn't in common Roman use. Oil and scraping was the actual cleaning method, and archaeologists have recovered strigils by the thousands, a genuinely mundane object that tells you a huge amount about how differently Romans approached basic hygiene than you do. Now here's the detail that turns public bath from nice amenity into genuinely radical social space, at least for a few hours a day. The baths were, for long stretches of Roman history, remarkably accessible across class lines. Entry fees to public baths were often extremely low, sometimes just a quadrans, the smallest denomination of Roman coin, low enough that access wasn't meaningfully restricted by wealth. Some baths, especially those funded by wealthy benefactors currying public favor, a very common form of Roman political self-promotion, were free entirely on certain days, which means for a few hours most afternoons, a senator and a shopkeeper, and depending on the period and the specific establishment, a slave being bathed alongside their owner might genuinely be occupying the same physical space, soaking in the same heated pools. That doesn't mean equality. It absolutely does not mean that. Wealthy Romans still had slaves attending them personally within the baths, still had access to private bathing suites in some of the grander complexes, still moved through the space with an entourage that marked their status even while undressed. But the basic infrastructure, the heat, the water, the marble, the mosaic floors that still survive today showing extraordinary artistic detail, was, in a meaningful sense, shared civic property, built and maintained specifically so that ordinary Roman life included daily access to genuine luxury. This is worth a real comparison to now, because it's one of the sharpest ones in this whole video. Imagine if your city's public infrastructure included, as standard, ordinary, unremarkable civic provision, heated pools, saunas, exercise facilities, libraries, and social space, all essentially free, used daily by people across a huge range of income levels. That's roughly what the Roman bath system represented for the population of the city. It wasn't a spa treat. It was closer to how you think about a public park, except it involved being naked in hot water next to your neighbors and possibly your senator. Mixed bathing is a genuinely disputed historical question worth flagging honestly rather than flattening into a clean answer. The evidence suggests practices changed over time and varied by location. Some periods and places had separate bathing hours or separate facilities for men and women. Other evidence, including some graffiti and literary references, suggests mixed bathing did occur, at least in some baths and some periods before later moral and legal reforms, notably associated with the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD, pushed toward stricter separation. Historians don't have full agreement on exactly how common mixed bathing was, or in which periods it was more or less accepted, and it's honest to say the surviving evidence is genuinely mixed, which, sorry, is an unavoidable pun given the subject. What's not disputed is how socially central the baths were as a site of business and gossip, functioning almost as an extension of the forum. Deals were discussed there. Reputations were built and destroyed there. Martial, predictably, has opinions. He complains in one epigram about a particular acquaintance who seemed to attend the baths specifically to be seen, moving loudly through every room, making sure everyone registered his presence, without actually appearing to enjoy any part of the experience itself. 2,000 years later, that's a genuinely recognizable type of person. And if you've ever watched someone perform an activity specifically to be seen doing it rather than to enjoy it, congratulations, you've met a Roman archetype that never actually left. There's a darker thread here worth not skipping past, because the quiet past exists specifically to look at who's doing the invisible work behind a nice scene, and the baths ran on an enormous amount of it. Someone had to keep the hypocaust fires burning constantly, a genuinely dangerous, hot, exhausting job, usually performed by slaves, working in cramped underground service spaces beneath the marble floors where bathers relaxed directly above them, never seeing or thinking about the person whose labor was keeping the water hot. Someone had to haul the fuel. Someone had to clean the pools. Someone had to manage the enormous volumes of water moving through the system continuously. The gleaming, civically generous, genuinely impressive Roman bath complex was underneath its floors, a hot, dangerous workplace running non-stop to produce leisure for people who, for the most part, never had to think about how it worked. That's Rome in miniature, honestly. A remarkable public good built on invisible labor, enjoyed by people who rarely had reason to look down. By late afternoon, you'd leave the baths refreshed, sociable, business half conducted through half a dozen casual conversations in warm water, and you'd start heading toward the final major event of the Roman day, dinner. And in wealthier households, dinner was not a meal, it was a production. The Cena, or how to perform wealth with your digestive system. You recline on a couch, not sit, recline, propped on your left elbow, because sitting upright to eat was considered somewhat unrefined among Romans who could afford to do otherwise, and the Cena begins. This is the main meal of the Roman day, typically starting in the late afternoon and in wealthy households, potentially running for hours into the night. And the structure of it, if you were dining somewhere genuinely well off, followed a rhythm you might actually recognize. An appetizer course, gustatio, usually featuring things like eggs, olives, and shellfish. In fact, the Latin phrase ob ovo usque ad mala, from the egg to the apples, meaning start to finish, comes directly from this meal structure, egg-based starter to fruit-based dessert. Then the main courses, the mensae primi, potentially multiple courses of meat, fish, and elaborate dishes. Then dessert, the mensae secundi, fruit, honeyed pastries, more wine. Wine, by the way, deserves its own moment, because Romans essentially never drank it the way you drink wine today. It was almost universally mixed with water, often quite heavily diluted, and drinking wine unmixed at full strength was considered a sign of poor breeding or outright barbarism. There was even a specific vocabulary for this. A symposiarch, or, in Roman terms, someone directing the evening's drinking, might set the ratio of water to wine for the group, sometimes for the specific purpose of controlling how quickly the party got out of hand. Now, the honest thing to say about elaborate Roman feasting is that the wildest examples, the ones that show up in nearly every documentary and article about Roman food, represent a genuine minority of actual meals, even among wealthy Romans, and it's worth being upfront about that rather than pretending every Roman dinner looked like a spectacle. That said, the spectacle version is documented, real, and worth walking through, because it tells you something true about what extreme wealth chose to do with itself in Rome. The most famous literary depiction comes from Petronius's Satyricon, written probably during Nero's reign in the 1st century AD, describing a fictional feast hosted by a wealthy, wildly ostentatious freedman named Trimalchio. It's worth being clear that Trimalchio is a satirical, fictional character, not a real historical person, but he's satirizing something genuinely real: the enormous nouveau rich wealth some freedmen managed to accumulate, and the specific, almost desperate way that wealth got performed through food. Trimalchio's fictional feast includes courses disguised as other things: a wooden hen that, when opened, reveals pastry eggs with a small bird cooked inside each one, a zodiac-themed course where each food corresponds to an astrological sign, and in the meal's most infamous moment, a whole roasted pig that appears to have been improperly gutted, prompting Trimalchio to angrily punish his cook in front of the guests before the cook reveals, as a planned trick, that the pig's stomach is actually stuffed with sausages and blood puddings. It's theater. It's a wealthy man spending an absurd amount of money and labor to prove that he could, staged specifically for an audience of guests he needed to impress. And here's the detail that actually matters more than the spectacle itself. None of this happened without an enormous, invisible workforce making it possible, and Petronius, even while satirizing Trimalchio's vulgarity, occasionally lets that workforce flicker into view. Slaves ran the kitchen. Slaves served every course, refilled every cup, cleared every plate, and in genuinely uncomfortable historical detail, sometimes provided musical or acrobatic entertainment between courses, their bodies and skills incorporated directly into the meal as decoration. A cook capable of producing the kind of transformative, disguised dishes Trimalchio serves would have been an extremely valuable, skilled slave, sometimes worth more than ordinary agricultural or domestic slaves specifically because of that culinary skill, which is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. A person's entire market value as a human being increased because he was extraordinarily good at making food look like other food. The real documented dishes that show up across Roman sources, not just satire, do include some genuinely startling items by modern standards. Dormice, specifically fattened for eating in special ceramic containers called gluraria, were considered a delicacy, sometimes served rolled in honey and poppy seed. Flamingo tongue appears in sources associated with extravagant taste. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, produced through a process that involved letting fish intestines and scraps ferment in salt over weeks, was an absolutely everyday condiment across nearly all levels of Roman society, not an elite indulgence at all. It shows up in recipes constantly, in a way that's genuinely comparable to how ubiquitous something like soy sauce or fish sauce is in various cuisines today. The smell of producing it, by every account, was reportedly horrendous, which is presumably why garum production facilities were generally kept well outside city centers. For an ordinary citizen, not the elite, not the desperately poor, somewhere in the middle, the Cena was a much smaller, quieter affair. Bread, a vegetable dish or legume stew. Romans ate a huge amount of legumes, lentils, chickpeas, various beans, as genuine dietary staples, not sides. Maybe some cheese, olive oil, wine watered down considerably. And if you were lucky, a bit of meat or fish, though meat was genuinely less common in ordinary Roman diets than modern popular imagination assumes. Most ordinary Roman protein came from legumes, fish more accessible than land meat, especially near the coast or the Tiber, and when available, pork, which was the most commonly consumed meat across Roman society generally. If you're picturing this meal, picture it not as a smaller version of Trimalchio's feast, but as a genuinely different kind of event entirely, quieter, functional, still social, but built around adequate nutrition rather than performance. This is worth remembering specifically because it's so easy to let one loud, memorable, satirical text, the Satyricon, define your entire mental image of what Romans ate, when it's describing something closer to the Roman equivalent of a viral video about an eccentric billionaire's birthday party. Entertaining, revealing about excess and status anxiety. Absolutely not representative of how most people, most nights, actually ate. And underneath both versions of the meal, the elite spectacle and the ordinary family dinner, there's the same basic truth. Someone grew the grain, someone milled it, someone baked the bread, someone fermented the fish, someone carried the water. In a society where, by some scholarly estimates, roughly a third or more of the population of Italy during the height of the Republic and early Empire may have been enslaved, the exact proportion is genuinely debated and varied significantly by region and period. An enormous amount of the labor sustaining even a modest Roman meal was invisible, unpaid, and legally considered property rather than personhood. That's the Cena. Now let's talk about what happened when the sun actually went down, because Roman nights were a completely different and genuinely more dangerous experience than Roman days. Rome after dark had no streetlights and no police. Here's something that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's easy to forget when you picture Rome as this grand, orderly civilization. Once the sun went down, the city had no public street lighting, no organized police force patrolling for crime, and for most of its history, no fire department worth the name. Let's take these one at a time, because each one changes how you'd actually experience being a Roman citizen after dark. No streetlights meant Roman streets after sunset were genuinely, seriously dark, aside from whatever light spilled from open doorways, torches carried by pedestrians, or lanterns held by slaves specifically employed to light the way for their masters moving through the city at night. If you were poor and had no slave to carry a lantern for you, you moved through the dark largely blind, navigating streets that were narrow, uneven, often covered in refuse. Rome had no comprehensive municipal garbage collection, and waste, including human waste, was frequently just thrown out of windows into the street below. a practice common enough that Roman law included specific provisions addressing liability for injuries caused by things dropped or thrown from upper-story windows. Juvenal, whose satires are, frankly, one of the best sources we have for what it actually felt like to be a stressed, complaining, financially precarious Roman citizen rather than a triumphant one, describes nighttime Rome with real, vivid dread. In his third satire, he has a character list off the specific dangers of walking home at night in the city. The risk of being struck by something falling or thrown from a window above. The risk of drunken young aristocrats picking fights with strangers purely for entertainment. The risk of straightforward robbery in streets with no lighting and no patrol. He describes needing a household lamp bearer just to survive the walk, and notes, with real bitterness, that a poor man without one is essentially gambling with his safety every single night just by needing to be outside. This connects to something you might not expect. Rome's lack of adequate nighttime safety infrastructure is part of why so much of the noisiest, most disruptive commercial activity in the city, deliveries, heavy cart traffic, construction hauling, was pushed specifically into nighttime hours. Julius Caesar, as part of broader traffic regulations recorded in surviving fragments of Roman municipal law, restricted wheeled vehicle traffic within the city during daylight hours, specifically to reduce congestion in Rome's narrow, crowded streets. Which meant the loud, heavy cart traffic that couldn't move during the day got pushed into the night instead, meaning Roman nights weren't quiet, dark, and empty so much as dark, dangerous, and in a lot of neighborhoods still surprisingly loud, full of the exact heavy cart traffic banned from daytime streets. The poet Martial complains about this directly, describing how the constant noise of night carts made genuine, restful sleep in the city almost impossible, unless you were wealthy enough to live somewhere with real distance from the main thoroughfares. Fire is the second major nighttime danger, and it's arguably the most serious structural risk built directly into how Roman cities were physically constructed. Insulae, remember, were often 5 or 6 stories, built quickly, sometimes cheaply, out of a mix of materials including wood framing, especially in the upper floors of poorer buildings, with narrow internal staircases that could turn into death traps if a fire started low in the building. Cooking fires, oil lamps used for nighttime light, and the general density of a city where buildings were packed close together with minimal gaps between them meant fire could, and regularly did, spread fast and catastrophically. Rome did not have an organized firefighting force for most of the Republic. It wasn't until 6 AD under Augustus that a dedicated firefighting and night watch organization, the Vigils, was formally established. Roughly 7,000 men, organized into cohorts, tasked with fire suppression and basic nighttime policing across the city's regions. Before that, firefighting in Rome had, at times, been handled by private, essentially entrepreneurial fire brigades, the most notorious example being one organized by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the extraordinarily wealthy Roman general and politician in the late Republic. Crassus's fire brigade would reportedly arrive at burning buildings, and before doing anything to actually put the fire out, negotiate a purchase price for the property with the desperate owner, buying it up cheap while it was actively on fire, and only then working to save it or the surrounding buildings for his own future profit. It's one of the more genuinely chilling entrepreneurial stories to survive from Roman history, a private fire brigade functioning less as emergency response and more as a real estate acquisition strategy built directly on other people's disasters. Even after the vigils were established, they weren't a police force in the modern sense you're picturing. They handled fire suppression and some basic night watch duties, but there was no dedicated, professional Roman police force systematically investigating crimes, patrolling neighborhoods, and maintaining order the way you'd expect from a modern city. Urban order relied heavily on a combination of the vigil's limited patrols, the Praetorian Guard and urban cohorts, who existed primarily for the protection of the emperor and general civil order rather than street-level crime prevention. And this is the important, uncomfortable part, a huge amount of informal, personal, patronage-based protection. If you were attacked, robbed, or wronged at night, your actual recourse depended enormously on who you knew, whether you had a patron with real influence, whether you had the resources to pursue any kind of formal legal action the next day. An ordinary citizen with no connections, mugged in a dark street at night, likely had very limited practical recourse beyond hoping the attacker was eventually caught by someone else, for some other reason. This is genuinely one of the sharpest contrasts between the polished image of Roman civilization, aqueducts, law codes, monumental architecture, and the lived daily reality for a huge portion of its population. Rome built extraordinary public infrastructure for water, for public bathing, for grand civic spaces. It built comparatively little for basic nighttime safety, and what protection did exist was distributed unevenly, tracking almost exactly the same lines of wealth and status that determined your place in the salutatio line at dawn. If you were wealthy, night in Rome could actually be pleasant. A private dinner running late into the evening by lamplight, entertainment, music, conversation, with slaves to light your way home afterward, and a household staffed well enough to secure your domus against intrusion. If you were poor, night in Rome was the most dangerous, least protected part of your entire day, spent in a dark, loud, occasionally burning city that had built magnificent aqueducts to bring you water, but had never quite gotten around to building anything resembling reliable protection for your physical safety once the sun went down. Which brings us, honestly, to a group of Roman residents we haven't spent enough time with yet, the ones for whom even a difficult, exhausting day like the one we've been describing would have looked genuinely comfortable by comparison. The Romans for whom citizen either barely applied or didn't apply at all. The citizen who almost wasn't there. Let's talk about the grain dole, because it tells you something the whole rest of this video has been circling without quite saying directly. A significant portion of Rome's own citizens could not reliably feed themselves without direct state intervention. The frumentatio, the public grain distribution, began, in something like organized form, in 123 BC, under the tribune Gaius Gracchus, who pushed through legislation providing grain to Roman citizens at a subsidized price. Over the following decades, through further political battles and reforms, including changes under Clodius Pulcher in 58 BC that made the grain distribution entirely free rather than subsidized. This evolved into a system where a substantial number of male Roman citizens residing in the city received a regular free grain allotment from the state, enough, by most estimates, to provide roughly a month's worth of basic subsistence bread per distribution. By the time of Augustus, records suggest roughly 200,000 citizens in the city of Rome were receiving this grain dole. 200,000 people. In a city whose total population is estimated to have been somewhere around 1 million at its peak, that means a genuinely enormous proportion of Rome's free citizen population depended, in some meaningful way, on direct state food assistance to survive. Sit with that for a second, because it directly contradicts a common assumption people carry into stories about ancient Rome, the assumption that citizen meant, more or less, person doing fine. It didn't. It meant a specific legal status, with specific rights, the right to vote, though the actual practical value of that vote varied enormously depending on which voting assembly and which era you're talking about. The right to a fair trial, again, with massive practical inequalities in how that played out. The right to hold certain kinds of property, and crucially, the thing that made the whole desperate machinery of urban Roman poverty survivable at all. Eligibility for state grain distribution if you happened to live in the city and qualify. Citizenship, in other words, was a floor, not a guarantee of a comfortable life above it. And for a huge number of Romans, that floor was barely above starvation, propped up by a grain dole that existed specifically because the ordinary economy of the city, day labor, small trades, unreliable work, simply did not, on its own, provide enough consistent income for a large fraction of the free population to reliably eat. This connects directly back to something we touched on earlier. The sportula, the small cash or food handout from patrons at the morning salutatio. For a poor citizen, the grain dole and the sportula weren't separate, unrelated Roman customs. They were two overlapping threads of the same basic survival strategy, public assistance from the state, supplemented by private assistance extracted through performed loyalty from wealthier patrons. Juvenal, writing his famous, bitter satires about Roman urban life, captures this precariousness again and again, describing citizens whose entire daily existence revolved around securing that day's food through some combination of the dole, the sportula, unreliable wage labor, and when all else failed, outright begging. And where did these citizens actually live? Back to the insuli, because it's worth returning to them now with a sharper, more specific focus on just how precarious that housing actually was. The upper floors of insuli, the cheapest, most dangerous apartments, were where the poorest citizens lived, packed into small, often poorly built rooms, with shared or non-existent sanitation, minimal structural oversight, and, as we've already discussed, serious ongoing fire risk. Building collapses were not a rare, freak occurrence in Rome. They were common enough that Roman writers refer to them almost casually. Juvenal specifically mentions the fear of a building collapsing on you while you sleep as one of the ordinary background anxieties of living in the city, right alongside fire and street crime. Cicero, in a letter, mentions with something close to grim amusement that he owns insulae that are literally falling apart, and that he's had trouble even finding architects willing to look at them, let alone repair them, because they're in such poor condition. A wealthy man, in other words, casually mentioning that he owns crumbling slum housing as a minor administrative annoyance rather than a humanitarian concern, which is its own quietly devastating historical detail, revealing exactly how normalized substandard, dangerous housing for the poor was among the people who profited from renting it out. There's a specific human thread worth pulling here rather than leaving this as abstract statistics. Consider what it actually meant, physically and emotionally, to be a Roman citizen, someone with real legal rights on paper, someone entitled to vote, someone who might, on a good day, stand in that salutatio line and receive an actual coin from a patron, while also living in constant, reasonable fear that your building might catch fire while you slept, might collapse under its own poor construction, and knowing that if either happened, there was no reliable emergency service. No guaranteed compensation, no real safety net beyond whatever grain the state currently chose to distribute, and whatever coins a patron currently chose to hand out. That's not a small contradiction. That's the central defining tension of ordinary Roman citizenship for a huge percentage of the people who actually held it. Real legal status, real theoretical rights, layered directly on top of genuinely precarious, physically dangerous daily material conditions. And even this precarious, difficult version of citizen life was still meaningfully better than the legal and daily reality of the people who weren't citizens at all, and who made up an enormous portion of the population working, cooking, cleaning, building, and dying to keep the entire system running. Which is where we need to go next, because you cannot honestly describe a day in Roman life without describing the people whose entire day belonged, legally, to someone else. The people whose day belonged to someone else. Every single thing you've experienced so far in this video. The water carried to your apartment, the toga folded onto your body, the bread baked before dawn, the oil scraped off your skin at the baths, the meal served course by course at dinner required labor. And an enormous amount of that labor, across Roman history, was performed by people who were legally property. Estimates of the enslaved population across the Roman world vary by period, region, and the specific scholarly methodology used, and it's honest to say historians genuinely disagree on precise figures. But even conservative estimates for Italy during the late Republic and early Empire put the enslaved population at somewhere in the range of a fifth to a third of the total population, with some regions and specific moments, particularly Italy in the century or so following the massive influx of war captives from Rome's conquests in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, potentially higher still. This wasn't a marginal institution. It was structurally central to how the Roman economy, and Roman daily life actually functioned. If you were an enslaved person in a wealthy Roman household, your day looked completely different depending entirely on your specific role, and Roman households sorted enslaved labor into an enormous range of specialized functions, far beyond simple manual labor. There were slaves who managed household accounts, essentially functioning as accountants or business managers. There were slaves trained as scribes, tutors, and secretaries, sometimes highly educated, occasionally more literate and better versed in Greek philosophy or literature than the citizen family that owned them. There were slaves specifically trained as cooks, valued, as we mentioned earlier, for genuine culinary skill. There were slaves whose entire job was dressing their owner each morning, or reading aloud to them, or accompanying them through the city as a visible marker of status. And there were slaves doing work you would recognize as brutal by any standard, in any era, working the mills grinding grain, sometimes literally chained to the grinding stones in punishment situations described in Roman comic plays as a genuinely feared fate, working the underground furnaces of the bath complexes in cramped, dangerously hot conditions. Working in agricultural gangs on large estates, sometimes literally in chains, housed in structures called ergastula specifically designed as slave barracks with minimal provisions for comfort or dignity. The legal reality underlying all of this labor, across its entire range from skilled household management to chained agricultural gang labor, was the same. An enslaved person in Rome had legally, essentially no independent personhood. They could be bought, sold, physically punished, and this is worth stating plainly rather than softening, legally killed by their owner in earlier periods with minimal practical consequence, though later imperial-era laws did introduce some limited restrictions on the most extreme forms of owner violence, reflecting at least partial, gradual recognition that total unrestricted power over another human being produced outcomes even Roman lawmakers eventually found troubling. And yet, and this is the detail that makes Roman slavery historically distinctive compared to a lot of other slave societies across history, including, notably, chattel slavery as practiced later in the Americas. Roman slavery had a formal, legally recognized, genuinely functioning pathway to freedom, manumission. An enslaved person freed by their owner became a libertus or liberta, a freedman or freedwoman, and crucially, this new status came with actual Roman citizenship in most cases, though a specific, limited version of it. A freedman gained the right to vote, though restricted to certain voting tribes that limited practical political influence. He gained the right to own property, engage in business, and marry freely. His children, born after manumission, would be full citizens, with none of the restrictions placed on the freedman generation itself. This mattered enormously, and it's worth sitting with why. It meant Roman society had a genuine, functioning, if imperfect, mechanism by which a person legally reduced to property could, within a single generation, or in some documented cases within their own lifetime, become not just free but a citizen, with children who carried no formal legal mark of their family's former enslaved status at all. We already met one spectacular example of what that could produce. Eurysaces, the baker whose enormous, unmissable tomb still stands in Rome. But there are other documented examples worth knowing, because they push back against any assumption that manumission was purely theoretical or vanishingly rare. Freedmen occupied genuinely significant economic and even political roles across Roman history. Pallas and Narcissus, freedmen serving in the imperial administration under Claudius in the 1st century AD, accumulated enormous personal wealth and real political influence, reportedly wealthier than many senators, managing crucial administrative functions of the empire itself, despite having begun their lives as enslaved property. Their power was resented, mocked, and satirized constantly by the freeborn aristocracy, precisely because it inverted the social order those aristocrats assumed was natural and permanent. But is important, because good history doesn't let you walk away with only the encouraging version. Manumission wasn't a right an enslaved person could claim. It was entirely at the discretion of the owner, who might grant it as a reward for loyal service, might sell it. Enslaved people could, in some cases, purchase their own freedom using a personal savings fund called a peculium, technically owned by the master but functionally managed by the enslaved person themselves, or might simply never grant it at all, for reasons ranging from genuine cruelty to simple economic self-interest in retaining valuable labor. For every palace or Eurysaces, there were vastly larger numbers of enslaved Romans who worked and died in the mills, the mines, the agricultural gangs, and the ergastula, with no realistic path to freedom ever presented to them at all. There's a specific, quietly devastating category of evidence worth mentioning here: Roman funerary inscriptions. Thousands survive, and among them are inscriptions set up by freedmen and freedwomen commemorating themselves, their former enslaved status stated plainly and without apparent shame: freedman of Marcus, freedwoman of Lucius, right alongside records of their own subsequent business success, their own households, sometimes their own slaves, because a freed person could, disturbingly but historically accurately, go on to own enslaved people themselves. Freedom in Rome didn't necessarily produce solidarity with those still enslaved. It produced, often enough, simple participation in the same system from a newly improved position within it. This is the uncomfortable, complicated truth sitting underneath the entire day you've been walking through in this video. The salutatio, the baths, the elaborate Cena, the forum's noisy commerce, the water flowing endlessly from the aqueducts, all of it rested on the labor of people with no legal personhood at all, some of whom might eventually, through luck, skill, or an owner's specific favor, cross over into citizenship themselves, and most of whom never would. Which leaves one more group we haven't fully addressed, a group technically holding citizenship or citizen-adjacent status their entire lives, and yet excluded by law from most of the actual civic machinery we've spent this whole video walking through: Roman women. Citizenship without the forum. Here's a specific, small legal detail that tells you everything. Roman women were, in a formal legal sense, considered Roman citizens' cives from birth if their parents were citizens. They just didn't get most of what citizenship, for men, actually meant in practice. No vote, no standing for public office, no serving on juries, no formal advocacy in court on their own behalf in most circumstances for most of Roman history. A Roman woman moved through life under the legal concept of tutela, guardianship, first under her father's authority, patria potestas, which was a genuinely sweeping legal power extending, at least in theory and in earlier periods, to the power of life and death over his children, though the actual exercise of the most extreme version of that power seems to have been rare and increasingly socially and legally constrained over time. If her father died or she married, guardianship might transfer to her husband or to a designated legal guardian, and many significant financial transactions required that guardian's formal approval. And yet, and this is where the story genuinely resists being flattened into a simple picture of total powerlessness, Roman women, especially freeborn women from families with any property at all, occupied a legal and social position that was, in certain specific respects, more independent than women in a number of other historical societies, including some considerably later ones. A Roman woman could own property outright. She could inherit. Under a marriage arrangement called sine manu, increasingly common by the late Republic, replacing an earlier form of marriage, cum manu, in which a wife legally left her birth family and joined her husband's under his direct authority. A wife retained legal ties to her own birth family, kept her own property separate from her husband's, and critically, kept control of her dowry in the event of divorce, rather than that money automatically passing to her husband's control permanently. Divorce itself, worth noting, was genuinely accessible to Roman women of citizen status, at least among the propertied classes, in a way that would surprise a lot of people who assume ancient societies uniformly trapped women in marriages by law. A Roman marriage, especially by the late Republic, was in some respects viewed as continuing only as long as both parties maintained the intention to be married affectio maritalis, and either party could, in principle, end it. Cicero's own daughter, Tullia, went through multiple marriages and at least one divorce during her lifetime, and Cicero's letters discussing these events treat the general fact of marital dissolution as an ordinary, if sometimes emotionally and financially complicated, feature of upper-class Roman life, not a scandalous rupture of unbreakable religious or legal bonds. We mentioned Turea earlier, and her story deserves fuller attention here, because it's one of the most remarkable surviving pieces of evidence for what an individual Roman woman's actual capabilities and actions could look like, regardless of the formal legal limitations technically surrounding her. The Laudatio Tuae, a lengthy funerary inscription, likely composed by her grieving husband, probably dating to the late 1st century BC, describes a woman who, during the violent political proscriptions following Julius Caesar's assassination, actively hid her husband from men sent to kill him, personally negotiated on his behalf, managed the couple's property and financial affairs during his exile, and according to the inscription, directly confronted armed men who broke into her home searching for him, physically standing her ground. This is a woman operating, in a moment of genuine political crisis, with real courage, real strategic capability, and real practical authority over her household's affairs, while simultaneously existing within a legal system that, on paper, still assumed she generally needed a male guardian's oversight for many kinds of formal transactions. The gap between that lived reality and the formal legal framework is worth sitting with, because it's a genuinely useful historical lesson that applies well beyond Rome. Legal status on paper and actual lived capability are not the same thing, and they can diverge enormously in either direction, depending on individual circumstance, family wealth, social connections, and simple personal will. That said matters, because it would be dishonest to let Turia's remarkable individual story stand in for the typical experience of Roman womanhood generally. The exceptional cases we have record of, almost by definition, survive precisely because they were exceptional, documented by wealthy families with the resources and motivation to commission elaborate funerary inscriptions. The vast majority of Roman women, especially those without significant family wealth, left essentially no individual written record of their own lives at all. We know about their existence largely through legal codes describing what they couldn't do, through male authors describing them from the outside, and through modest funerary inscriptions recording little more than a name, an age, and a husband's or father's name attached. What would a typical non-elite Roman woman's day actually have looked like, walking alongside the day we've traced through this whole video? For a woman managing a household, whether that household was modest or genuinely wealthy, an enormous amount of unpaid, largely undocumented labor and management fell specifically to her. Textile production, notably, was considered a core, almost defining virtuous activity for Roman women across the social spectrum, from empresses to ordinary citizens' wives. Augustus himself, in a detail that's simultaneously a bit touching and a bit revealing about the performative politics of traditional values, reportedly insisted on wearing togas woven at home by female members of his own household, specifically as a public demonstration of old-fashioned Roman domestic virtue, even while ruling over an empire whose actual textile needs were, obviously, met at enormous industrial scale through slave labor and commercial production. The wife who managed a household spinning and weaving wasn't performing a decorative hobby. She was overseeing genuine, economically significant domestic production and, in wealthier households, managing the enslaved labor, actually doing much of that physical spinning and weaving under her direction. If you were a working-class Roman woman, your day likely involved direct participation in whatever trade or business your family engaged in: shopkeeping, food preparation and sale, textile work, and for some, prostitution, which was legal in Rome, taxed by the state, and occupied a genuinely complicated, low-status but formally regulated position within the Roman economy and legal system. Funerary inscriptions record women working as midwives, hairdressers, wet nurses, shopkeepers, and skilled craftswomen across a range of trades, suggesting a working economic life for a huge number of ordinary Roman women that simply doesn't fit neatly into a picture of women confined entirely to purely domestic, invisible roles. So here's the honest, layered picture this chapter has been building toward. Roman citizenship for women was real in a specific, meaningful legal sense: inheritance rights, property rights, a formally protected place within Roman law and Roman religious and social life, while simultaneously excluding them from the entire visible, dramatic forum and salutatio and voting booth version of citizenship this video has spent most of its runtime describing. A Roman woman's day ran alongside the day of the men in this video, intersecting with it constantly, essential to nearly every part of it functioning at all, while remaining largely invisible in the specific historical sources that tend to define our popular image of what Roman life looked like. Which is honestly exactly the kind of gap this channel exists to point at. Leisure was never actually free. Let's circle back to something we mentioned early on and never fully unpacked: odium. Leisure, the thing wealthy Romans considered the truly noble use of time, as opposed to the grubby necessity of negodium, business. Pliny the Younger gives us one of the most detailed surviving descriptions of what an elite Roman's ideal daily rhythm actually looked like, in a letter describing his own routine at his Laurentine villa, outside the pressures of city business. He describes waking whenever he chooses, sometimes working through problems in his head before even rising, dictating to a secretary, walking, reading, a light meal, more reading or writing, a bath, dinner with simple conversation and early sleep. It's a genuinely appealing picture, deliberate, unhurried, intellectually engaged. It's also a picture available to essentially nobody except a small, wealthy, land-owning elite whose entire material existence was being generated elsewhere by other people's labor while they contemplated literature at their leisure. That's worth sitting with, because leisure in Roman elite thought wasn't the absence of work. It was time freed up specifically because someone else's work had already covered the actual necessities. Pliny's secretary taking dictation. The slaves running his household and estate. The tenant farmers or enslaved agricultural workers producing the food and income underlying his ability to spend an afternoon reading Livy by a fire. Odium, as a philosophical ideal, required an entire invisible economy of negodium happening around it, performed by people who never got written up in flattering letters about the noble contemplative life. For ordinary citizens, leisure looked completely different, and it looked more often than not like public spectacle. And this is where we need to talk about games, because they're one of the loudest, most expensive, most politically calculated forms of leisure Rome ever produced, and almost none of it happened by accident. Gladiatorial games, chariot races at the Circus Maximus, and theatrical performances weren't simply entertainment that happened to exist alongside Roman civic life. They were deliberate political tools, funded by wealthy individuals and, later, the state, specifically to build public loyalty, popularity, and political capital. The phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, comes directly from Juvenal, writing critically about exactly this dynamic. A Roman public that had, in his bitter assessment, largely traded meaningful political engagement for the guarantee of free grain and free entertainment, content to be managed and pacified rather than genuinely governed with their consent. The Circus Maximus, at its largest capacity, could reportedly hold somewhere in the range of 150,000 spectators, a figure so large it's worth just sitting with for a second, because it means a genuinely enormous cross-section of Roman society, citizens and non-citizens, men and women chariot racing, unlike gladiatorial combat seating in later periods, doesn't seem to have enforced the same strict gender-separated seating, rich and poor. It could occupy the same physical space simultaneously, watching the same event, cheering for one of typically four racing factions, the reds, whites, blues, and greens, that functioned almost like ancient sports team loyalties, complete with fan rivalries serious enough to occasionally produce actual violence. Chariot racing was, if we're honest about the numbers, considerably more popular and more central to Roman entertainment culture across most of Roman history than gladiatorial combat, despite gladiators dominating modern popular imagination of Rome. And it was by every measure an extraordinarily dangerous profession. Charioteers, driving light, fast vehicles at high speed around tight turns, faced serious, frequent risk of catastrophic crashes, and many died young. And yet successful charioteers could become genuinely, enormously wealthy and famous, arguably the closest thing Rome had to modern celebrity athletes. Gaius Appuleius Diocles, a charioteer whose career spanned the 2nd century AD, has a surviving inscription recording his career earnings at a figure so large that modern historians attempting to convert it into equivalent value have suggested it may represent one of the largest individual fortunes accumulated by an athlete in recorded history, ancient or modern. He started, notably, as a slave, or at minimum from extremely humble origins, and built that fortune purely through skill and survival in one of the most dangerous jobs in the Roman world. Gladiatorial games deserve their own honest treatment because it's easy for modern popular culture, including plenty of Hollywood films, to romanticize them into something closer to noble single combat than what the actual historical evidence supports. Most gladiators were enslaved people, criminals condemned to the arena as a form of judicial execution, or prisoners of war, forced into combat with genuinely limited say in the matter, regardless of skill or fame achieved along the way. A smaller number were free volunteers, auctorati, who took on gladiatorial status voluntarily, sometimes desperate men seeking money or fame, occasionally even, in documented and scandalous cases, members of the aristocracy seeking notoriety, prompting legal restrictions specifically aimed at preventing higher status citizens from debasing themselves in the arena. Death rates in the arena, based on surviving inscriptions and scholarly analysis, appear to have been considerably lower than popular imagination assumes for at least some periods. Trained gladiators represented a genuine financial investment for the Lanista who owned and trained them, and killing off expensively trained fighters in every single match would have been economically wasteful. Many contests, especially in earlier periods, likely ended without a death, through surrender or a decision by the match's sponsor. But the risk was always real, the violence was always genuine, and for the enslaved and condemned majority forced into the arena, none of it involved meaningful consent regardless of the actual statistical odds of survival in any given match. And here again is the labor question this entire video keeps circling back to. Staging a single major day of games required an enormous logistical operation, almost entirely invisible in the popular image of Romans watching gladiators. Someone had to capture, transport, and maintain exotic animals for the Venetians, the staged animal hunts that were often the opening event of a day of games, lions, leopards, bears, and in some of the most extravagant recorded spectacles, animals brought from as far as North Africa and beyond, at extraordinary logistical cost and difficulty. Someone had to train the gladiators for months or years in dedicated schools, the ludi, feeding and housing them, managing their specific combat specialties. Someone had to build and maintain and eventually repair structures like the Colosseum itself, completed around 80 AD under the Emperor Titus, an engineering achievement involving an elaborate underground substructure, the hypogeum, packed with mechanical lifts and trapdoors allowing animals and scenery to appear suddenly on the arena floor above, operated entirely by manual labor working in cramped, dark conditions beneath the spectacle happening overhead. That underground labor is, honestly, one of the most quietly perfect metaphors this entire video has produced. The most famous, most photographed, most instantly recognizable symbol of Roman civilization, the Colosseum, physically contains, built directly into its structure, a hidden underground layer of intense manual labor, entirely out of sight of the spectators above, whose work made the visible spectacle possible. You could sit in the stands, watching an animal apparently materialize out of the arena floor as if by magic, entertained for an afternoon, with genuinely no reason to think about the people working in cramped darkness directly beneath your feet who made that trick happen. That's not a metaphor the quiet past is imposing on Roman history from the outside. That's just what the Colosseum's actual architecture literally is. What the day leaves behind, so let's put the whole day back together, one more time before we close. You woke before full light to a rooster and a city already moving. You dressed in wool laundered with someone else's collected urine. You stood outside a rich man's door and let a slave call your name out loud, in an order that told everyone present exactly how much you mattered. You walked to the forum through streets built on public water that, at least, never asked what you were worth. You did business, or watched business get done, in a legal system built on genuinely durable ideas of codified law and public trial, applied with genuinely durable inequality. You soaked in heated water kept hot by someone working unseen in a hole beneath your feet. You ate a meal modest or absurd, depending entirely on an accident of birth you had no control over, prepared, served, and cleaned up by people whose personhood the law didn't fully recognize. And you went home, if you were lucky, through dark streets with no lights and no police, hoping your building didn't catch fire or fall down before morning. That's a day. That's citizenship. Real legal status, real rights on paper, sitting directly on top of a system that measured you constantly, ranked you publicly, and depended at every single hour on the invisible labor of people the system refused to fully count as people at all. Here's the thing that should genuinely stick with you, and it's not a comfortable one. Almost none of that machinery has actually disappeared. It's just changed its clothes. You don't stand outside a patron's door at dawn anymore. But you might check a message thread you know you need to respond to fast, because being visibly, promptly available to the people above you in a hierarchy is still, in a lot of workplaces, exactly the kind of unpaid performance that determines whether you get the next opportunity, the next promotion, the next bit of goodwill you might desperately need someday. You don't receive a sportula in coins outside a rich man's atrium. But plenty of people still perform loyalty they don't entirely feel to people with more power than them, because the alternative, losing that relationship, carries real material risk. You don't live in fear of your insula catching fire with no fire department coming. But entire populations, in cities all over the modern world, still live in housing they know is unsafe, owned by landlords who, like Cicero mentioning his crumbling rental properties in a letter, sometimes treat that danger as a minor administrative inconvenience rather than a human emergency. And the invisible labor question may be the single thread running underneath every chapter of this video, hasn't gone anywhere either. Somebody is still working underground, figuratively if not literally, so that the visible, photographed, celebrated version of daily life can run smoothly overhead. Somebody is still growing the food, cleaning the buildings, driving the trucks at night so the streets are clear during the day, doing the invisible maintenance work that everyone depends on and almost nobody thinks about, right up until the moment it stops happening and everything visible grinds to a halt. Rome didn't invent inequality, obviously. No single civilization did, but Rome did something specific and genuinely useful for us, historically. It wrote an enormous amount of its daily inequality down, in exhausting, specific, often unintentionally honest detail. Martial complaining about his ruined togas, Juvenal cataloging the terrors of a dark street, Cicero mentioning his crumbling slum housing in the same breath as his political ambitions. A freedman baker building the loudest tomb in Rome, specifically because the people who might have looked down on his trade couldn't stop him from being remembered. A funerary inscription for a woman who held off armed men at her own front door, while on paper, the law still assumed she needed a guardian's signature for major decisions. All of that survived. Not because Rome was uniquely cruel or uniquely honest, but because it was, among other things, an extraordinarily well-documented civilization, obsessed enough with writing, law, inscription, and record, keeping that an enormous amount of its ordinary daily texture survived 2,000 years, while plenty of comparably complex societies left us almost nothing at all about what an ordinary Tuesday actually felt like for the people living through it. That's the gift this particular civilization left behind, whether it meant to or not. Not just aqueducts and roads and legal concepts still humming along quietly in the architecture of modern life. A genuinely detailed record of what it felt like to be ranked, measured, and sorted by an entire society every single day, from the moment you woke up to the moment you finally, if you were lucky, made it home. You're not standing outside anyone's door tomorrow morning waiting to be called by name. But it's worth asking, honestly, which version of that line you might still be standing in without quite noticing, dressed in slightly different clothes. That's the day. That's Rome. Thanks for spending it with us. If this kind of history is your thing, the invisible machinery running underneath the visible monuments, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Drop a comment and tell me which hour of this day you'd have hated the most. I read every single one. And if you know someone who thinks ancient Rome was just togas and gladiators, send them this. Let them find out it was mostly a line, a ledger, and a lot of people working where nobody was looking. See you next time.